From the Gates, a story of divine dealing through Dunkirk by Captain H.E. Beresford Mash. Chapter 6, Test of the Promise. That Friday afternoon, the 31st of May, was the end of Dunkirk week. A pall of smoke had been lying over Dunkirk, some 10 miles away, ever since we had been in the proximity. At night, the sky was lit by a livid glow from the fuel tanks, which had been burning for days. The road to Dunkirk was strewn with wreckage and pitted with bomb craters. It was strongly rumored that accessibility to the town was impossible, and that the port had ceased to function. Our orders were that we were to march to Bray Dunes, where we were to be evacuated, and we set off at 4:30 in 2 parties of 50 each. I was one of the last 4 in the rear party. Our section took the route along the dunes, and not that along the road, but during the first hour we were broken up so many times by aerial attack that the 4 of us lost contact with the main party. Looking back to La Panne from along the dunes, we saw the town was being heavily shelled, and a great cloud of thick smoke began to gather over it. We were not sorry to be out of it, but we thought of the men still there. When we reached what we thought was Bray Dunes, we could not locate the main body of our unit, but we contacted an embarkation officer who instructed us to go on to Dunkirk a few miles farther. There was nothing for it, of course, but to go on. But owing to the continuous attacks and hard going, it was nearly midnight when we came within sight of Dunkirk Mole. It was a tough trek. We had little water and no food, and the water soon went, for there were others besides ourselves who were glad to see it. At one point along the beach there was a barrage of shellfire across the sands and out into the sea, but by keeping up in the dunes we were able to walk underneath the screaming shells and reach the other side. There were some who hadn't made it, and, lying there silent on the sands, they seemed to make a mute appeal against the madness of war. I remember on that trek, watching in the distance 2 other men who had followed the water's edge for some miles. I noticed one had his arm in that of the other. Later, he put his arms across the other's shoulder, and his friend put a supporting arm round his waist to help him along. The man was giving out, but it was not apparent to us at a distance that the man was wounded. A little later, before we came up with them, they stopped. The man in difficulties sank to the ground, and his friend knelt beside him on the sand. When it was over, the kneeling man covered the sleeper's face and got up and went on alone. Such incidents happened all around. Life slipped quickly away, but the full story of the Dunkirk beaches reveals that life came to Dunkirk as well as death, spiritual life. There were men who were definitely converted when they stood or lay on those beaches. The testimony of not a few of them is that even in that unlikely place and amid all the confusion of warfare, they heard the voice of Christ appealing for the personal surrender to him. They are with us today and bear this testimony gladly. Now, even in the Bible, you have mention of presuming that the voice must be, like Paul, the guy, someone who he was persecuting, probably said, "I'm who you or persecuting. But, it was attributed to be Jesus. Did the voice ever say it was Jesus? No. And people have interactive memories at times. It happened frequently that, as men were attacked, they lay on the sand, and some prayed almost for the first time. When they got up again and saw that the machine gun bullets had traced a pattern round their impression in the sand, the conclusion that God answers prayer was inevitable. Two of us, a chaplain from our unit and myself, had kept together all the time, and together we spent part of the night in a hole on the beach. During the night, we found a naval officer who had come ashore, and although attempts were made to get us away throughout the night, these all failed. Ultimately, there came the dawn of Saturday, June the 1st, perhaps the strangest dawn I can ever remember. But with the daybreak came renewed and fiercer bombing. It was about 2 hours after the dawn that we finally got off by wading out into the water to a small boat put out by one of the destroyers standing near. About 50 of us got to this boat and climbed in, although I was promptly drawn underneath it before getting in. We set off for the destroyer, but a new and terrific aerial attack, easily the worst, was launched at the destroyers. There were 5 ships lying off, and at this point, they all went into rapid action as wave after wave of dive bombers came in. They cruised round at high speed and kept up an incessant barrage with their guns while our little boat bobbed about like a cork on the water. It was amazing how it kept the right way up several times. We were nearly blown out of the water as the bombs rained round us like hail. The words of truth were not without their application. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. This attack seemed to last a long time, and there seemed no end to the successive waves of bombers. But eventually the sky cleared, and we made for our ship, which was then 2 or 3 miles from the shore. We hurried up the ship's ladder, and there at the top something happened, to which, in a sense, I owe my life. As I followed my puttery friend and the other men on to the deck, someone caught hold of my arm and pulled me out of the file. It was a naval medical orderly. He had seen the Geneva cross on my arm and concluded I was a medical officer. For some reason, they were without one at that moment. And down in the sick bay, they had a number of men urgently needing attention. The orderly had almost pulled me down there by the time I explained that I was a dental officer, but I said I would certainly see if I could do anything for them. I took a quick look at the casualties and went into the cook's galley nearby to take off my wet clothing. My great coat and clothing, soaked as they were so heavy that I was unable to move freely, and so, in order to be freer to do something in the sick bay, I discarded all my clothes except my shirt and trousers, and my boots. If I had not done this, I could never have kept afloat later in the water. All this occupied less than 5 minutes, and then, on my way back to the sick bay, there came another climax. Through an open hatch, I heard the gun above go off a couple times, and I sensed we were in for another attack. Unfortunately, we were still stationary and must have presented an easier target. Sure enough, the whistle bombs came to us through the open hatchway. The first bomb struck the water right beside the ship and seemed to lift it clean out of the water. There followed a most uncanny stillness which I have never been able to explain, and inside the vessel it gave me the impression of being suspended in midair. The whistle of another bomb nearer than reached us, and this time a direct hit was scored on the ship down forward. There was a terrific crash and shudder, and the ship tipped forward at once. What was most unpleasant next, however, was that the whistle of a third bomb coming through the hatch above us was much louder than the other two. It was so loud that it seemed obvious it was coming straight at us where we were. I shall never forget those moments, although I often wish I could. But there are parts of the memory which are worth keeping. As we waited, I found myself watching the face of each man opposite me, for I stood against a wall in a small, confined space, probably about 12 feet square, and half a dozen of the crew stood along the wall opposite. We were all holding on to something because at each crash we had been nearly knocked off our feet. Some were kneeling. I watched them, waiting. Those men were fine. They were waiting for death, and I knew it. The bomb came through. There was a terrific explosion, and a roar of flame spread over us. It seemed strange. I had been standing alone. The flame shot round and behind me, where I was, only burning the back of my head and neck. Along the opposite wall, some had their faces burned. The explosion left me stunned and dazed to such an extent that at first I had the strong impression that I had been killed. I remember clearly, though, that my chief emotion at that moment was one of disappointment, but it was only momentary. Just for a brief second, there had flashed through my soul the unworthy doubt that God had failed to keep his promise, the promise of which I had been so sure. Well, people conclude that something's fate, and it turns out not to be fate. And they were never told it was fate in any direct way. I remember, in a dazed kind of way, looking up and saying, "Then, Lord, this is the end." Just for that single second, I doubted. But the doubt was soon gone. The ship had turned over, and we could no longer stand upright when, in the middle of the confusion of that moment, a man's voice rang out clear and calm, as if nothing had happened. It was one of the men on the opposite wall. "Help each other out," he said, "and go steady and call the boys up below." And this he did himself. He went to the gangway and called. Some of them got out. By this time the ship had listed right over on the side where the last bomb had hit. We could hear the water rushing in, and it sounded as if it were tearing the plates of the ship apart like paper. Oil and water seemed to be everywhere. At the sound of the voice opposite to me, I seemed to come out of my daze and, like the others, realized I was still capable of action. We helped each other out through the little doorway in the corner, but it was not easy getting through, as the deck had tilted to an angle of about 45 degrees, so that the door was nearly where the ceiling should be in a normal room. Outside, we made for the upper deck, and here we found ourselves on the upper side as the ship heeled over. Soon I found myself alone. Some decided to stay on the ship until the last. Others took to the water, or had already been sent overboard. As I felt the ship giving quickly, I felt convinced she would go down within a few minutes and draw us down in the plunge. I felt sure the only chance was to be in the water, and at some distance from the boat, if there was time. I climbed down the parapet, therefore, and then looking down, I saw the ship's ladder sloping down the side of the vessel to its little platform That platform was right opposite to where I stood. But although it looked a long way down the side of the ship, I felt absolutely no hesitation in the decision I made. I decided at once to slide the whole height of the ship and came down on my feet on that platform. It never occurred to me that I might miss, and I remember the surprised look on the face of the man standing on the lower rungs of the ladder as I came down smack in front of him. I think he thought that I had bailed out from somewhere celestial. I stood up. The platform, instead of being the water's surface, had been drawn up by the overturning of the ship and was now about 12 feet above the water. I took one look at that last 12 feet and the thick black oil below and dived into it. And we've seen the mention previously that this is the peak chapter of the book, but maybe a peak in a way, and the other peak is towards the end.